Hello and welcome to episode 221 of the Chills of Will podcast. Pleasure today to be speaking to Martha Ann Toll. Martha Ann Toll's debut novel, Three Muses, was shortlisted for the Gotham Book Prize and won the Petrichor Prize for finely crafted fiction. Three Muses has received glowing tribute since it came out in September 2022. She writes fiction, essays, and book reviews and reads anything that's not nailed down. She brings a long career in social justice to her work covering authors of color and women writers as a critic and author interviewer at NPR Books, The Washington Post, Pointe Magazine, The Millions, and elsewhere. She also publishes short fiction and essays in a wide variety of outlets. Toll is a member of the National Book Critics Circle and serves on the board of directors of the Faulkner Foundation. Her second novel, Duet for One, will be out in early 2025. Good morning slash afternoon. How are you today?
I'm good. Pete, thank you so much for having me on. I'm very excited to talk to you.
Also great to talk to you. Three Muses is running through the brain. Haven't just finished it recently. And like I said, congratulations. Look forward to talking about that in a little bit.
Thank you.
Tell us about the cool meaning of the word petrichor for the prize that you won.
I was saying before we got on air, I had never heard this word before, and I actually
Oh,
thought it was a proper name, but it turns out to be an English word that means the smell of cut grass after a rain.
oh man, so cool. As is the title of your 2025 Duet for One, that seems to be an oxymoron of sorts, or I always get that mixed up with a paradox. But um, tell us maybe about that, about the as little or as much as you want to talk to us about your future project, and also all the good stuff. Where should we buy Three Muses? Any particular bookstores? All that good stuff.
Well, thank you. I'll start with Three Muses. It should be available in any bookstore, and if it's not, I always love independent bookstores, but you can get it on Amazon or online at bookshop.org or any online outlet. If your bookstore doesn't have it, it should be pretty easy for them to order it.
Okay, cool, cool, cool.
Or your library, it's in libraries as well.
Yeah.
And to answer your, I know we're going to spend more time on Three Muses, but to answer your question, my next novel is coming out in May 2025. It's called
Ooh.
Duet for One, and there's several duets for the in the book. On page one of that book, which is coming out next year, there's a husband and wife two piano team. They're world renowned and they perform as two pianists together. And the wife has died on page one. And so that's one duet for one. The husband is not only bereft of his marriage, but of his entire career.
Whoa.
And their son, Adam, is a violinist. And while his father deeply mourns his mother, Adam is thrown into a state of confusion, ultimately recognizing that his mother was not there for him at all emotionally. So Adam is a professional violinist. It's also a lot about his musical story,
Mm.
but his is a quest for love because he hasn't been able to really retain a relationship, um, probably because he needs to deal with his stuff with his mother.
Mm. Wow. Very, very interesting. You talked about growing up, reading anything that wasn't, well, not just growing up, but reading anything that's not nailed down. So what did that look like as a kid? I mean, were you the kid always in the library checking out whatever the
Yeah.
maximum was? How did that work with your reading and writing life?
Well, for sure. And you sound like you might have been the same kind of kid.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
my mom and dad were incredibly passionate about reading and books. My mother, they were first generation educated in their family, first generation to go to college. My mom was a professional editor and she was freelance. She was a copy editor, so she worked at home. So she always had the dining room table filled with galleys and a sharp pencil. In those days, no online editing. And she could find a mistake in anything. And my dad was a lawyer who was passionate about the written word,
Mm.
and he kept a big fat Webster's Unabridged dictionary next to the table and a set of encyclopedias. And if anybody didn't know anything, you had to stop and look it up. We had to
Mm.
memorize poetry for dinner. My mother got me a library card as soon as I was eligible. I actually remember that. I was in second grade,
Mm.
and books, books, books. So I think it was in the water supply, and also I just loved reading. I All my friends were readers. I was, yeah, always in a corner with a book, basically.
Mm.
Still true.
Yes. Who were some of the writers, or what was some of the writing that really, lit that spark?
Well, I for years and years I only read fiction.
Mm,
Um, and really anything, I read I read the children's classics, and my parents read them out loud to us as well. The children's Homer, Charlotte's Web,
mhm,
um, The Wind in the Willows, and anything you can think of. And then as I got older, then I graduated high school. I went to public high school. I graduated in January, and I thought, oh, I can't go to college without having read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and all that. I can't believe I was doing this at age 17.
mhm,
But got to go through Dickens, got to go through all this stuff. In fact, I didn't really do any English in college. I was a music major,
mm,
but still reading. Then I went to law school, always had a fiction book, but now I am a more eclectic reader. I still read as much fiction as I can get my hands on, but I also read a lot of memoir and also a lot more nonfiction than I used to. I think that's partly to fill in my own kind of very limited understanding of American history, which was a very white understanding of my own Jewish history, since I did not have a formal Jewish education.
mm.
And then anything, you name it, anything. So Africa, Christianity, whatever it is, I
Yeah.
read a lot of nonfiction.
How about the writing spark? I mean, were you submitting poems? I seem like a lot of people were poets first, but I don't know if that was you. What kind of
No,
like set it off where you're just like, oh, I can do this and people enjoy it, or I enjoy it.
that took a long time. I was always a writer. I always kept a diary from very young age. I always made notes about books that I read. I kept vocabulary lists, all that stuff. I kept lists of all the classical music I was memorizing on the radio. And then I'm one of four sisters. I think we used to perform plays, and I would write the plays. So I was always writing. And my professional life, before doing writing full time, was extremely writing intensive.
Mm,
But I didn't, and I was writing. I tried some short stories along the way. I was essentially rarely submitted anything. Nothing ever got published. But my mom died very suddenly in 1999, and that is when the floodgates opened. I had always wanted to write fiction. I think I was always reading as a writer, like taking in the writer's life as I was reading.
mm.
But that was when I really sat down to write a novel, and I had the experience that many people have of writing a bunch of stuff that didn't go anywhere, but that's part of your apprenticeship.
As you know, in 2024, who are some of the writers who, I mean, I know you, well, let me ask you this too. As writing reviews and such for, for NPR and working with the critic circle and all that, like, does that deter your reading pleasure? Do you read kind of like like you're breaking down, like you're diagnosing, or do you feel like that enhances it? Or you're still able to read for pleasure in those
That
cases?
is such a good question. And yes, I definitely read for pleasure. So my feeling, I heard a lecture a long time ago, maybe 20 years ago, about book reviewing, and it was a panel, and they all sort of agreed with each other that the point of a book review is to make readers want to read the book, or to spread the joy, and not so I try to find the best thing that I can in a book and think about what readers might want to like in it. I I have had a couple of times where I couldn't stand the book so much that I asked to be excused because I don't like trashing books in print.
Mm,
Um, so the book reviewing I think it keeps me honest on some level. First of all, I like knowing what's coming out. But
mm,
second of all, it's a very fixed deadline, whereas writing fiction is takes a long time. It took me 10 years to write Three Muses. So it keeps me with at least one toe in the real world, which I think is
sure.
really important.
Right. That makes sense. Who are some of the writers who really you really inspired by, challenged by in more contemporary times?
hmm Well, two writers that I adore who are Vikram Seth is one. He's still alive. He wrote a
Mm,
book called An Equal Music that kind of shifted my whole way of thinking about writing, also very much about classical music.
mm,
And Shirley Hazard, who died, I guess, within the last 10 years. She's Australian but lived here. I love her writing. There's a lot of contemporary writers that I love. I love Kiese Layman and Garth Greenwell, Alex Chi. Um, there are just so many. I read a lot of books in translation, and there's
Mm.
a lot of writers from around the world that I love. So what I think I could generalize about is I care very much about the craft of language. So I tend to go for the more literary types,
Yeah,
generally.
that makes sense. You talked about your training in with music, your love of music, and obviously, the book is called Three Muses. I wonder just about the idea of muses for you. Do you seek out muses? Is music a natural one? Is it something where it's just like art begets art, where you just
Mhm.
sit in front of a blank page or a blank computer and just put on classical music? I wonder how those things work together.
It's such a good question. When I first started writing, seriously, again, it was in 1999. I basically wanted to get music on the page. That was my very first aspiration. Of course, that's an impossible aspiration because music is ephemeral and words on a page can live. But that's always my driving interest. I want my language to sound musical. I really care about that. I also, for years and years, I did have music on when I was writing, and I realized that it was turning me into this sentimental mush. And my writing was
Ah,
it became too melodramatic, too sentimental. So
wow.
now I write in absolute silence
Hmm.
because I don't want to affect my emotional state with anything except for the words.
Wow, that's very interesting. Huh.
Yeah,
So Three Muses came out in 2022. Um, I would love to know maybe some of the seeds for the book.
sure. Um, well, I had the idea early on, partly inspired by a misunderstood story of a Holocaust survivor whom I was very close to. So I had the idea of a Holocaust survivor who survives because he is pulled out of line to the gas chamber as a boy to sing for the commandant of the camp. And that's how he survives, by singing for his family's killer. And then I also had the idea of a ballerina. So those two were like kind of floating around my head for a while. And I was looking around for a vehicle of some sort to structure the book. And I discovered this tradition in Greek mythology that I had never heard about that had three muses. Sometimes we learn about nine muses in Greek mythology, they tend to be better known. These three muses from the region of Boeotia in Greece are song, discipline, and memory. And I felt like I was struck by lightning because those three
Hmm.
things are probably the things I care about most in my writing. So,
Hmm.
song in my book represents music and the trauma that the protagonist John has around music, but also that it saved him. And discipline is something I'm really interested in. I think we all want to know what makes artists tick. And I am definitely from the school that it's 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration.
Hmm.
And memory is, I think, what drives most writers, but memory is something that human beings have that we don't really share with the rest of the animal kingdom so far as we know. But we hold memories in different ways, and because our lives take place through time, time and memory are very intertwined.
Hmm. Hmm. So yeah, the book starts off, the introduction starts off with those definitions or descriptions of the muse of song, which is music's primal form, the muse of discipline, rigor, practice, and preparation for prayer, and then muse of memory, transforming forgotten to feral quicker than an asp's sting. Speaking of sting, the John, who we later find out about, an earlier name and everything like that, but John, 1963, and he's in Paris
Hmm.
and talking about, the not for a temporary time, not feeling the echo or the sting of his German past or of the German past. He gets a ticket to the Three Muses, ballet, right? And at first he doesn't want to go. I forget. I think he kind of just wanted more to like explore the city, right?
And he doesn't like being around music because he knows it's going to
Yes,
traumatize him.
yes. And as he goes to, he ends up going to the show and he's transported to childhood, which in this case, like you said, is not a positive thing. He just, he thinks about his family that's all gone. He thinks about the music. The music is painful for him, right? Until he sees Katya, the muse of discipline, the dancer, and she really rouses him out of his the funk. He ends up giving her flowers at the end of the show. What was it about the about her dance, about the music, about the music that he was able to get past, or at least temporarily get past the horrible blocks he had versus music? What was it about her performance that really roused him?
Well, he basically just it was love at first sight, and
Yeah.
which is always a hard thing to explain, right? But he was so worried about being in the theater and listening to music, and he wanted to run away. And suddenly she bursts on stage. She's the prima ballerina, and he thinks she's absolutely beautiful, and he can't believe what she can do with her body and how she relates to the music. And he has this sense that he needs to know her, and she has a parallel sense that there's somebody out in the audience that understands her. She just feels that her dancing is being understood in a really deep way.
Hmm.
But I don't think we can explain that kind of,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
love.
Right. Right. Yep. Katya is works with or works for or all the above Boris. I'm sorry, remind me of his last name again?
Boris Yannikov.
Right,
Yeah.
who's the legendary, teacher and choreographer and director. And we learn pretty quickly that they're lovers.
Hmm.
There's the back and forth. The story goes back and forth. 1963 goes back to the end of World War II, to the concentration camps. 1953, I want to say, maybe, back and forth. But we learned that she really has a longing for him, or thinks that she should be attracted to him, or she is, but it's, I don't know the psychology of it, or how deep you want to go into that. But he's not quite a father figure, but he's definitely older. Maybe she's seeking that out, but we do learn that they are the lovers, as well as um
Collaborators.
collaborators.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I love that you asked this question. It was kind of yes to all of the above.
Mhm.
To be a professionally trained ballerina is one of the most sheltered things you
Sure.
can be. Like many in her time, nobody would have finished high school because you would go into the company directly at age 16 or 17. That is often true today. People finish with a correspondence course or something, or
Mm.
GED. Um, and her mother died when she was very young, so her world is very, her dad's trying to keep the house together and,
Mhm.
earn a living, and um her whole world is ballet. So she definitely longs for Mr. Yanikov, and but it's very, very fraught, and there's a lot of me too in this relationship. And I realized I didn't, it's going to sound weird, and I don't mean to be insensitive. I didn't think about it a lot because it's so real. I wasn't thinking about the political implications of this when I was writing. But then when it was time to publish my book, I thought the people will want a trigger warning for this. So on the back of my book, I said, this is an abusive, fraught relationship, because there's some people, it's upsetting. I mean, he's old enough to be her father, and he takes her as a lover when she was 17 or 18. But it's not all abuse. That's the complexity, and that's what's hard to get your head around. On some level, they really do love each other. And Katya, until she meets John and has a different perspective, one of her biggest frustrations with Boris Yanikov is that she doesn't get credit for co-creating their work together, which is very 1950s. Unfortunately, it still happens today, but in the 1950s, she definitely would not have gotten credit. And she loves that part of their relationship, that they create these dances together, but he's the only one who gets the credit. So it's fraught on a number of levels.
Yeah, the idea of the Me Too, for sure. I mean, there's like you said, it just, it all started on not a lie, but it all started in a horrible way, right? It all started um, in a very fraught way, to say the
Yeah.
least. You were talking about like the GED and correspondence degree and stuff. When she first started dancing, I think it was the lady at the store was like, "Oh man, she's 8. It's kind of old, old to
Yeah.
get started, right?"
Which it really is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A
So
lot of little girls start at age 3 or 4. Yeah.
so there was a flashback to 1944, which is when her Aunt Mary, who was the one who got her into to dance, tells her that Catherine's mother had been killed in an accident, in a car accident, as a, I guess, pedestrian, I guess, right?
Hmm.
And so obviously that set her world into absolute chaos. And dance in some ways was the rigor, was the discipline, was the practicality that kept her, I guess, kept her sane, right?
Yeah. And it gave her life some shape. And I
Yes.
don't think Aunt Mary or she was Catherine then,
Mm.
or her dad expected her to take to it, but she really takes to it.
Yeah, definitely took to it right away, and like I said, it was a respite for her.
Hmm.
The parallel story in 1944 is as horrible as it gets for in the history of humankind. There's the how would you pronounce the name? Janko?
Yanko. So his name,
Janko.
Yanko. Yeah. So
Janko. Go ahead.
When John was born in Mainz, Germany, and um, at that time his nickname was Yanko, and both of these characters have their name changed. We can talk about that.
Hmm.
I had a cousin, an older cousin, who grew up in Mainz and lost her family in the Holocaust. And she ended up here and wrote a beautiful memoir for the family about her growing up in Mainz. And one of the things that is so striking for so many victims of the Holocaust is she was just like living a regular life. The Jewish community in Germany was very, very assimilated, and some people said like I didn't even know I was Jewish until Hitler came to power. So some of the details from the setting in Mainz are from my cousin Alan Boucher's family memoir. But yeah, I guess I would say both characters suffer a lot of loss at an early age. John is perhaps, well, I don't like comparing losses, but John lost everyone.
Yes.
He lost everyone.
Yes. And as you talked about, I mean, just I say decision and dilemma wasn't that he had a choice. That he was basically taken out of line and sung for the commandant. Is that how you say the word?
Hmm. Hmm.
Right. And as so many times throughout his life, he goes into to psychiatry himself, but also himself as a patient, and
Hmm.
just the absolute horrific extent of the horror, and but just the idea that he felt a sense of guilt. I mean, guilt definitely goes
Hmm.
throughout the book. Um, Catherine later on, or Katya, his American family, we'll talk about in a minute. They tell him you have no reason to feel that, and we as the reader know that he doesn't. But I wonder if you can maybe just talk a little bit about that uh, horrific sense of guilt that he felt, that
Hmm.
he was singing for these drunken Nazis as his family perished.
Hmm. So it's when Yanko is standing in line, it's his mother who's holding his baby brother Max, who says to the SS officer, he can sing, Yanko can sing. So she saves his life. So it's definitely a Sophie's Choice type
Mm-hmm.
situation. And it's so the consequences are so terrible that, and John comes to this country when he's about to America when he's about 15. He doesn't have the means to think through it. All he feels is tremendous survivor's guilt, which is extremely common in this kind of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Why did I survive and no one else? And it is a huge amount of guilt. Why does he get this life and his family didn't? But it's also an almost unbearable sense of responsibility that
Yes.
if I'm the one who survived, I have to do something with my life. I have to make my life
Mm-hmm.
meaningful, to honor those who are lost. And I also feel that this is not something that there's any closure. You
Mm-hmm.
don't get over that level of trauma and that level of loss. So partly his life challenge is to learn how to live with it and find some joy in the present, and he wants to use his experience to help others.
Yeah. Um, when it reminds me a lot of the book Night, Elie Wiesel,
Mhm,
and but
mhm.
just like so much of like, oh my gosh, it almost got to the end of the war, even before a lot of people were put in the camps. It wasn't that everyone was in the camps for like 9 years. It was
Right,
something where, right, where even 1944 is really towards the end, and it's just like, oh my gosh, if he only could have, they only could have
right.
been able to stay out of sight for another, just horrific. Doesn't but so when the soldiers come and liberate, that's really um when John Yanko,
Mhm,
who had been really, cloistered, if you will, in the house, where he really finds out the full extent of the horrors and
mhm,
all the refugees
mhm.
and people just just skeletal. Um, you talk about how, and so I mean nothing is left in minds for him. I can't even
Yeah. I
imagine.
mean, so there were different Holocausts in different countries.
Sure.
Hungary was the latest, and the Hungarian government, even though they were allied with Germany,
Hmm.
did a lot to not to prevent deportation, or at least to stall things, but they couldn't stall them enough. So like most of the Hungarian Jewish population was wiped out, but it was, as late as 1944, 45 that they were
Yeah.
deported. And the real killing machine. I mean, the Nazis in Eastern Europe were just basically having Poles and Ukrainian Jews dig their own graves and just basically machine gunning 20,000 people at a time. But the so there was a lot of killing before what we think of as the gas chamber was developed, and it was partly developed because German soldiers were getting traumatized by killing so many people. So
Mm.
they needed to do something to remove them from the killing. So first they gave them silencers on their guns, and then they were like, oh, they wanted to make it more efficient. I mean, there's a lot of horrible details here, but the real mass kill. I mean, there were mass killings before 42, but after 42, it was accelerated to a tremendous extent.
Right. As Johann or Yanko goes overseas, he later looks back and is just like, oh my gosh, these paper pushers. There's so many people in my life who are really great to me, great for me, despite the fact obviously he lived through such an absolute horror. He's named, kind of given the name by one of the guys on the ship, John Curtin,
Hmm.
right? Curtin. And there's obviously a lot in this book about reinvention, which, as you said, you can never close the chapter on a Holocaust background. Is not something you can ever get over. But just this idea of, in some ways, what choices do we have other than to kind of restart and reinvent ourselves, right?
Yeah,
Um,
well, so first of all, I want to thank you so much for doing such a close reading of my book and for getting it. It makes me feel great, and I really appreciate you as a reader and an interviewer. Thank you. Um, John, yeah, he thinks everybody in America is named John, so he figures, oh, I'll pick a really American name. And he goes, I'd love to have a curtain and bring it across my whole past. And to your point about him, and then the person on the boat doesn't know how to spell curtain, so actually spells curtain wrong.
Mhm.
But to your point about unlikely heroes, that's true in any crisis situation. People are saved or helped by very, very unlikely heroes. And that it takes John a lifetime to understand that the cook, the,
Mhm.
the German woman who cooked for the commandant, actually saved his life. He doesn't see it, he just sees her as being
Kind of like a
kind
taskmaster, right?
taskmaster, exactly, and not feeding him enough and all that stuff. But she protected him, and similarly, there were other people along the way who were able to help him get to where he got to, and he couldn't realize it at the time. And I think that's part of human nature. Heroes come from really unlikely places.
Yeah.
But yes, he definitely wants to reinvent himself. He wants to not think about it, but of course, because of the level of the trauma, he can't help but think about it. So that's kind of a conflict for him.
Yeah. Man, the irony of when the soldiers come to liberate, I just had a total brain freeze on the woman's name, the
Frau
cook,
Cook,
Frau Cook, right?
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And how she was like basically what he's not one of us, he's one of them, which obviously in many ways could be seen as fingering him as Jewish and different in, like,
Hmm.
going to the camps and putting on the trains. But in this case, it was the opposite, right? As in, he's innocent. He's not one of us. He's a victim here,
Yes,
right?
yes. So she really saved his life because otherwise they could have assumed that, he was her son or something like that.
Yes. John goes with a family of really just nice, just salt of the earth type of people, the Katzes, and he lives with them. Like I said, he moves to the States when he's about 15, 16, and he definitely he goes on the road to becoming a psychiatrist, a therapist himself, and part of that is being a patient, which he could use, like all of us could use anyway. But
Hmm.
there's that guilt over the singing that we talked about. It brings back so many memories. His psychiatrist unfeeling, or is that just the way that John feels?
I think a little of each. So
Yeah,
John is, as you said, adopted by a family that lost a husband and wife who lost
right.
their only son in Sicily. Their names are Barney and Selma, and they basically just adopt him out of the goodness of their heart, and they stake him to a medical school education because that's what they would have done for their
Mm-hmm.
son who was killed. And by happenstance, a guest at the house says, "Oh, you should become a psychiatrist, be a brain doctor because you sure
Mm-hmm.
need help." So, as
Mm-hmm.
part of his training, he has to go through his own analysis. And his training psychiatrist is meant to feel pretty harsh because this is such painful excavation.
Right.
But the psychiatrist, his name is Dr. Roth, is really, really insistent and also very unorthodox in the way that he does things. I think nowadays we would have different treatment modalities that would be more
Mm-hmm.
gentle, but um, so he has to go through this, and John experiences it as pretty torturing
Mm-hmm.
for having to revisit all of this. But of course, that's one way that people move on is by acknowledging their own memory.
Right. One person who doesn't acknowledge his own memory, at least, I guess publicly, or yeah, more in a public sense, is Boris.
Hmm.
John and Katya both, find like their first lovers in these flashbacks, and we talked about the lover as Boris, and that might not,
Hmm.
not even be the right word, right, because of the power
Yeah,
differential.
right.
Um, but Boris, I think he actually calls one of his plays present tense, and he lives in the present tense.
Hmm.
He doesn't write things down. There's no way of memorializing the plays, the choreography, the action. And while of course John and Katya, or John and Catherine, obviously have such vivid pasts that really make their way into their memories and their thoughts all the time.
Hmm.
When John is obviously seems to be always haunted, and we understand why. He he's talked about in the third person with the psychiatrist,
Hmm.
right? Is what's the almost like a
He
go ahead.
Well, John starts to talk about himself
That's what
in
I
the
mean.
third
Excuse me. Yes,
person
yes.
because he starts to talk about Yanko, who is himself as a
Mm-hmm.
boy, in the third person, and it's probably to distance himself from that
Right.
experience. And to your point about Boris Yannikov, the choreographer, that's such a good point. I never really have articulated it that way, but it's true. We don't know anything about Boris's
Mm-hmm.
past. We know that he was born in Russia, but nobody in the ballet company knows really anything about him. Is he married? Does he have one wife? Does he have two wives? Nobody
Mm-hmm.
really knows. And yes, he's all in the present, and he's 150% about his art form. That's what he cares about.
Right. Right. There's grief all over. You talked about there's grief over Buddy. Buddy was the Katz's son, who was a joker, was a just a pleasure to be around, and he was, like I said, killed overseas in the war. And John in some ways is kind of living in his footsteps. I mean, he's got his, wears some of his clothes, kind of thing, lives in
Mhm,
the bedroom, like he gets his medical degree that would have maybe
mhm,
gone to Buddy. um John and Katya come together,
mhm.
and it's actually a good, I think, spot to kind of stop. I think we're less than a minute here. Stop for this before